November 15th, 1974. Fox Theater, Detroit. 8,000 people packed into red velvet seats, creating a rumble of anticipation. But backstage, in a cramped dressing room that smelled of cigarettes and stale cologne, Marvin Gaye sat alone in front of a cracked mirror, watching his hands tremble. He hadn't been home to Detroit in 2 years. 2 years since the fights with his father had escalated to the point where neighbors started calling the police. 2 years since Anna packed her bags and walked out of their marriage, taking with her the last illusion that love could be anything other than painful. 2 years since everything in his life had collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm, leaving him to pick up pieces that no longer seemed to fit together. The stage manager knocked. 5 minutes, Mr. Gaye. Marvin nodded without looking away from his reflection. His face seemed older than his 35 years. Lines etched around his eyes that hadn't been there before the drugs. Before the night spent lying awake, wondering if success was supposed to feel this empty. His chest felt tight, constricted, like someone had wrapped steel cables around his ribs and was slowly turning a winch. This was supposed to be a homecoming, a triumphant return to the city that had given birth to the Motown sound. The local newspapers had called it a celebration, a chance for Detroit to embrace its prodigal son. But all Marvin could think about was the house on Outer Drive, where he had grown up, where his father still lived like a spider in a web of scripture and rage, where the sound of leather hitting flesh had been as common as morning prayers. He closed his eyes and he was 8 years old again, cowering in a corner, while his father preached about sin between blows. Where was God then? The questions had haunted him for decades, eating away at his faith like acid. 2 minutes, Mr. Gaye. Marvin stood up, his legs unsteady beneath him. He looked at himself one more time in the mirror, straightened his burgundy suit jacket, and forced his mouth into something resembling a smile. The show must go on. It always did, no matter what was breaking inside. The lights dimmed. The crowd erupted into a roar that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth. And Marvin Gaye walked onto the Fox Theater stage, his smile painted on like stage makeup, his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The orchestra struck the opening notes of Distant Lover, and Marvin let his voice float over the melody like smoke rising from a fire. The audience swayed in their seats, 8,000 bodies moving as one, mesmerized by the voice that had soundtracked their lives, their loves, their losses. But Marvin's eyes weren't on them. They were scanning the crowd, searching the faces in the darkness, looking for ghosts from a past he spent most of his adult life trying to forget. Detroit had given him everything and nothing. It had given him Berry Gordy in Hitsville, USA, the studio where he learned to turn pain into music. But it had also given him a father who confused love with violence, a childhood that felt like a war zone, and scars that never quite healed. 3 songs into the set during Let's Get It On, something made Marvin look toward the orchestra section. A flash of movement caught his eye. Someone standing up in the sea of faces. An elderly black man, maybe 72 years old, with gray hair that caught the stage lights like silver wire, and a weathered face marked by decades of hard living. The man was covering his eyes with his hands and his shoulders were shaking. He was crying. Marvin's voice caught mid-note, the word healing dying in his throat. He knew that face. Even 40 years older, even bent with the weight of time, even blurred by distance and stage lights, he knew it. Mr. Williams, his third-grade teacher at Fairmont Elementary, the only adult who had ever shown him unconditional kindness during the worst years of his childhood. The music continued around him, but Marvin wasn't on stage anymore. He was 8 years old again, sitting in Mr. Williams's empty classroom after school, too afraid to go home because his father had been drinking. Mr. Williams never asked questions about the bruises. He just let Marvin stay, helped him with homework, shared his lunch. When the bruises were bad, he would quietly move Marvin to the front of the class, away from other children's stares. "You're a smart boy, Marvin," Mr. Williams used to say, his voice gentle in a way that made Marvin's chest ache because gentleness was so rare in his life. "Don't let anybody tell you different. You got music in you. I can hear it when you hum while you're working. That's a gift from God, and nobody can take that away from you." "Wait," Marvin said into the microphone, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. "Wait." The music stopped. 8,000 people fell silent. Security guards looked nervously at each other, unsure whether this was part of the show. Marvin set down the microphone with shaking hands and walked to the edge of the stage. The audience held its collective breath as their idol, the Prince of Soul, stood at the precipice between performer and person, between the man they thought they knew and the broken boy he had never stopped being. "Mr. Williams?" Marvin called out, his voice carrying across the theater like a prayer. "Is that you, Mr. Williams?" The elderly man looked up, tears streaming down his cheeks in silver tracks that caught the stage lights. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak, his voice thin and wavering, but audible in the perfect silence. "Marvin, little Marvin Gaye," the crowd murmured in confusion, but Marvin heard nothing except the sound of his own heartbeat and the voice of the man who had saved his life with simple kindness. Without hesitation, Marvin jumped down from the stage. He pushed through the orchestra pit, past confused musicians, past security guards who stepped aside. The audience watched in stunned silence as he made his way through the theater, climbing over seats until he reached the elderly man. When Marvin finally reached him, he wrapped Mr. Williams in an embrace that seemed to last forever. The old man's body felt fragile in his arms, bird-boned and delicate, but Marvin held on like he was drowning, and Mr. Williams was the only life preserver in an endless ocean of pain. "I remember you," Mr. Williams whispered, his voice trembling against Marvin's ear. "You were such a scared little boy. You used to come to my classroom when your daddy was—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Some truths were too heavy for words. "You saved me," Marvin said, and his voice broke like glass hitting concrete. "You were the only one who was kind to me, the only one who saw me." The old man's hands, spotted with age and trembling with emotion, reached up to touch Marvin's face. "You were special even then. I could see it in your eyes, behind all that fear. You had light in you, boy. Look at you now. Look what you became." But Marvin couldn't see what he had become. All he could see was what he had lost, what he had never had, what he would never have. Success felt hollow when there was no father to share it with, no parent to call and say, "I'm proud of you," and mean it. Fame was just another kind of loneliness, and money couldn't buy back a childhood or heal wounds that had been festering for decades. Marvin led Mr. Williams back to the stage, the crowd parting before them like the Red Sea. 8,000 people rose to their feet as they climbed up together, the applause building to a crescendo that shook the theater's foundation. But the sound felt distant to Marvin, like it was coming from underwater or from another dimension entirely. He picked up his microphone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "This man," he said, his voice thick with emotion that he had spent years learning to hide, "this man saved my life when I was 8 years old, when nobody else cared, when I was invisible, when I thought I didn't matter to anybody in the world. He did. He saw me." He turned to Mr. Williams, whose eyes were bright with tears and something that looked like pride. "Will you sing with me, like we used to in your classroom?" They sang "What's Going On" together, Mr. Williams' wavering, uncertain voice joining Marvin's smooth baritone in a harmony that transcended technique and touched something deeper, something primal and true. The crowd was on their feet, crying, cheering, witnessing something that felt more like a religious experience than a concert. But Marvin barely noticed them. All he could see was the man who had given him hope when hope was the only thing keeping him alive. But even in this moment of connection, of healing, of public redemption, something inside Marvin was breaking apart. Because for every Mr. Williams who had shown him kindness, there was his father. For every gentle word, there had been 100 cruel ones. For every moment of safety in that classroom, there had been years of walking on eggshells at home, never knowing when a wrong word or a misplaced toy or the simple act of existing would trigger another explosion of righteous fury. After the song ended, after Mr. Williams returned to his seat, after the concert resumed, something had shifted inside Marvin. He sang his hits, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. He was thinking about phone calls he needed to make, conversations he had been avoiding for years. The rest of the concert passed in a blur of muscle memory and professional autopilot. Marvin's body moved to the rhythms. His voice hit every note with practiced precision. His face wore the appropriate expressions of joy and seduction and soulful intensity. But his mind was elsewhere, floating somewhere between a classroom where he had felt safe and a house where safety was a luxury he couldn't afford. Backstage after the final bow, after the last encore, after the crowd had finally filed out into the Detroit night, Marvin sat alone in his dressing room, staring at a black rotary telephone that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. His hands were still shaking, his shirt soaked with sweat that had nothing to do with stage lights and everything to do with the conversation he was about to have. He had to try. After 30 years of wondering, 30 years of hoping, 30 years of carrying around the weight of unanswered questions, he had to ask. Mr. Williams had shown him what love could look like, what kindness felt like, what it meant to be seen and valued and protected. Surely his father, seeing the man his son had become, could find some small measure of pride, some tiny acknowledgement that maybe Marvin wasn't the disappointment he had always been told he was. With trembling fingers, he dialed his childhood home. The phone rang several times before his father answered. "Hello?" The voice was rough, impatient, exactly as Marvin remembered it. "Daddy, it's Marvin." Silence stretched across the telephone line like a canyon too wide to cross. Marvin could hear his father breathing, could picture him standing in the same kitchen where he had delivered so many lectures about sin and failure and the wages of disobedience. I performed tonight in Detroit at the Fox Theater. 8,000 people came to see me sing." More silence. "I met someone there. My old teacher from elementary school, Mr. Williams. You remember him? He was kind to me when I was little, when things were hard at home, when I needed—" Marvin's voice trailed off. "How do you ask a father why he couldn't love you? How do you beg for affection from someone who has spent decades withholding it? How do you explain that success means nothing when the person whose approval you crave most treats you like a stranger?" "Daddy," Marvin said, his voice breaking like a teenager's, "why couldn't you be like him? Why couldn't you just be kind to me? Just once? I tried so hard to make you proud. I became famous. I made money. I put our name on records that people all over the world know. Why wasn't that enough? Why was I never enough?" The silence stretched so long that Marvin thought the line had gone dead. He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel tears starting to blur his vision. Then his father spoke, his voice cold and final as a tombstone. "You always were weak, boy, crying about every little thing. Still are, I see. All that success, all that money, and you're still the same weak little boy who couldn't take his punishment like a man." The line went dead. Marvin sat holding the phone for a long time after the dial tone began, the sound buzzing in his ear like an angry wasp. The weight of his father's words settled over him like a blanket made of lead, pressing down on his chest until breathing became an effort that required conscious thought. Even now, even after everything he had accomplished, every barrier he had broken, every heart he had touched with his music, he was still that scared 8-year-old boy hiding in Mr. Williams' classroom, still waiting for love that would never come, still hoping for acceptance from a man who seemed incapable of giving it. He left Detroit that night and swore he would never perform there again. The city held too much pain, too many memories that cut like broken glass every time he tried to examine them. Even the good memories hurt because they reminded him of what he had been missing all along, what other children took for granted, what he would never have no matter how successful he became. 3 months later, on a cold February morning, Mr. Williams passed away in his sleep. Marvin got the call while he was in Los Angeles, hiding in his house on Gramercy Place, avoiding the world and the questions it kept asking, questions he didn't have answers for. He wanted to go to the funeral, wanted to stand at the grave of the man who had shown him that adults could be kind, that not all authority figures were threats, that sometimes being seen and valued was possible. But he couldn't face Detroit again, couldn't risk running into his father, couldn't handle the weight of family obligations and neighborhood politics and the complicated dance of pretending that his childhood had been normal. Instead, he sent flowers. White lilies, because Mr. Williams had once told him that lilies meant rebirth, and Marvin hoped that wherever his old teacher was now, he was being reborn into a world where kindness was rewarded instead of punished. The card read, Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for caring when no one else did. Thank you for showing me what love looks like. Marvin. For the rest of his life, whenever anyone asked Marvin about Detroit, about why he stopped performing in his hometown, about what had happened that night at the Fox Theater, he would get that distant look in his eyes, the same expression he wore when reporters asked about his father or his childhood or the source of the pain that seemed to seep through even his happiest songs. Too many ghosts, he would say, his voice flat and emotionless. Too many memories. But what he never said, what he couldn't bring himself to articulate even to his closest friends, was that the worst part wasn't the bad memories. It was the good ones. They made the contrast sharper, more painful, more impossible to ignore. Mr. Williams had shown him what love could look like, and that knowledge made his father's cruelty that much more devastating. Knowing that kindness existed made its absence feel like a physical wound that never stopped bleeding. That night at the Fox Theater, when those two worlds collided on stage in front of 8,000 people, it didn't heal anything. It just made the wound deeper, more obvious, harder to pretend didn't exist. Sometimes light makes darkness more visible. Sometimes kindness just reminds you of all the kindness you never received. And sometimes even love can feel like another form of loss. Marvin never performed in Detroit again, and Mr. Williams never knew that the scared little boy he had tried to protect grew up to be a man who was still scared, still hurt, still waiting for a father's love that would never come. The ghost followed Marvin wherever he went after that night. Every stage, every song, every moment of his remaining life was haunted by the memory of what kindness looked like and the absence of it where it mattered most. Success became meaningless when there was no one to share it with who truly mattered. That was Marvin Gaye's tragedy. Not that he never experienced kindness, but that he experienced just enough to know what he was missing. Just enough to understand the shape of the hole in his heart, but never enough to fill it.